say their little plant fact, and then hop into their presentation. And then I will come back to, I wanted to go kind of over the curriculum because there are some points that I wanted to highlight, Ronnie and I, but we'll do that after their presentation between the discussion. So yeah, Dr. Carolyn Ramzy is an associate professor of ethnomusicology at Carleton University. Her research focuses on Egyptian Christian popular music in Egypt and a quickly growing diaspora community in the United States and Canada. Specifically, she examines the gendering of Coptic liturgical music and the discursive politics of the community's religious pop songs known as Teratil and Teranim in the lives of the Coptic Orthodox women following the Egyptian uprisings. And she has many, many publications. So you can easily find her if you have access to the academic sphere. Yes, and to read, she's very formative for me when I found her as an undergrad. So I encourage you all to look up a lot of her articles. And Dr. Mariam teaches in the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies departments at, I'm gonna mess this up, Cerritos College and California State University, Long Beach. She is the author of a really interesting book called Gendered Paradigms in Theologies of Survival, Silence to Survive, which I actually added to the curriculum for you all to check out as well. Yeah. So Dr. Carolyn, we will, did Mariam just up and, okay. Dr. Carolyn, we'll start with you. And then when Mariam comes back.
Sure. I was wondering if I can have the permission to share our screen, because we put together a little PowerPoint just to kind of help us navigate through the chat. And I'll wait. Okay, there's Mariam. Mariam's hopping back on. But if I can have that permission, that would be great. It says here, I still don't have permission, but if I can, then at least we can look very adultish and have our PowerPoint running. Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you for that, Val. So I'll share my screen just to show you. Mariam and I put together a little PowerPoint presentation just to help us walk through the chat. We've got a lot of other things we want to showcase, but I thought we would do that. Can everybody see my screen okay?
Yes.
Yeah, I see people nodding, so I'll assume that. And I may not, because I'm using it on the shared Google, and let me see how I can make it an actual, well, we're all looking at this screen. Maybe I'll start there. Is that okay? So I think what I'll do first, first I want to thank Lydia and El Mahabba and all of the labor that has brought us to this space, and for the very kind introductions and for getting to know you all. I think I'll start with my plant thing, and then I'm curious to hear Mariam's plant thing. I'm a terrible green thumb. I'm notorious around the neighborhood. I've had neighbors be like, so what's up with the ragweed on your front yard? And I'm like, I don't know, it's a plant, I leave it there. So that's my plant story. I have accepted that shortcoming, that failure. I embrace it, I celebrate it, but I'm probably the only one that does. So I think the way we wanted to craft today's conversation is to kind of bring you into the informal conversations Mariam and I have often had together. Some of the rich, best conversations I've had about my research I've often had with Mariam. And so we wanted to sort of start by first sort of introducing, a little bit of our own work and some of what we do. And then in this kind of informal reparee style where we sort of go back and forth, walk you through some of our thoughts with the assistance of this PowerPoint that we put together. And then to engage in the kind of camaraderie that I really appreciate Al Mahabba space creates in this kind of SWANA school. Like I'm really excited to be here and to kind of continue the conversation in the kind of breakout rooms afterwards. So maybe what I'll do is I'll pass the mic to Mariam, since your slide is this one, to have you introduce yourself, introduce your work, and then we'll go from there.
All right, thank you. So yes, I'm Mariam Youssef. She, her pronouns, although I'm trying as hard as I can to make Tunt a pronoun that people will call me. And thank you, Lydia, for the introduction. You covered a lot of it, but I work and teach in gender, sexuality studies, and women's studies, and specifically all of my research focuses on the gender and sexual dynamics of survival communities, particularly survival religious communities. So what happens when a religious community is experiencing discrimination, genocide, persecution, and how does that impact women, queer people, trans folks, non-binary folks, et cetera, and the dynamics of how we talk about gender in those spaces when survival is on the line. So that's me. My fun plant thing is I currently have 48 plants in my home, and it's becoming a problem. So I don't have a lot of space, and every flat space is covered with a plant. It's mostly house plants, but I do have a little herb space and some tomatoes and some onions and stuff like that, just so that I don't have to buy those at the store. And I'm trying to get into like some like herby witch stuff with my herbs. So I've been learning a little bit about how to use my herbs for stuff like that as well. So that's me. So yeah, I'll turn it back over to Carolyn so you can talk a little bit about our methodologies.
I believe you're on mute.
Oh, thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I was just gonna say, I'm gonna exit full screen just because I like to cheat and see what the other slide is. But I wanted to actually introduce a little bit of my work in the same way that Mariam was introducing this idea of thinking about women and gender studies and the ways in which our work is intersected to allow us to ask the kind of questions that we do. And often I introduce myself largely to like music students as to kind of start forecasting some of the intersections that we all bring to our spaces and our conversations. I always tell them that I'm a Kuwaiti-born Egyptian-American Canadian who disciplinarily identifies as an ethnomusicologist. So an ethnomusicologist is a person who studies music as culture. And I really came to ethnomusicology to ask questions about my own culture and to ask questions about my own upbringing, about my own musical spaces or musical soundscapes. So the ways in which my world sounded. And I often show them the slide where I have Nirvana, Handel, and a liturgy playing at the same time. And I sort of hit play and it's really cacophonous. And the students, oh, and the Radiohead, you can't forget the Radiohead. And so I have it all playing at the same time. And the students are sort of like, what is going on? And I'm like, this is the world's, our musical tastes are the ways in which we navigate and reflect and reconcile and think about our world. But a big cornerstone of that was Coptic music for me. So I came to that space, some of the articles that I've worked on, I know Lydia, you forecast some of the publications and the ways, and I see it richly intersect with the ways that Mariam and I have our chats, is I often think about the ways in which we learn about our worlds and how we can be in our worlds. So what it means to be a Copt, what it means to be a Coptic woman or somebody who identifies as a woman, what it means when people start to break away from this and perhaps become unchurched, begin to sort of ask questions about gender identity, class identity, all of these things is through what people put in their ears. So their headphones, their phones, and music that sort of comes in sometimes without our own control. So going to church every Sunday and Wednesday night and Friday night for hours and hours and hours at a time. So that's a little bit of what often sort of engages what I think about. And so, one of the things I learned in partnership with Mariam and something I had been also pursuing on our own is thinking about what it means to decolonize our methodologies. You'll probably see on the screen, I have two images side by side. And the one on the left is of one of the earliest ethnographers, sort of four figures in the field, in my field of ethnomusicology. And her name was Frances Densmore. And historically, music scholarship, particularly the kind that I do, started as a way to record people that were outside of the Western classical canon. So you can imagine some of the kind of exclusions that were based on race. So here you can see an Indigenous person. In Canada, we say Indigenous people. In the US, people say Native Americans. The exclusions based on class. So if you don't have access to classical music or lessons or the ways in which comportments are taught through the ear, how to listen. And Frances Densmore worked for the government. She recorded music to basically inform the government about a sort of vanishing Native American culture as Native Americans were being pushed out of their own land. So the earliest ancestry or genealogy of my field really began as an apparatus of colonial practices in North America and in Europe as an extension of Europe. But increasingly, our field has changed, and not just my field, many disciplines are starting to reckon with that history. So the image that you see on the right is of, I don't know if you can find the ethnographer or the person doing the research with the camera. So the person dressed in black and has a camera is me a long time ago doing field research in Egypt, and really coming to this space to learn more about and to ask questions I could never ask in sort of open spaces in my own community or in my own world. And so I went back to Egypt as a diaspora kid to basically ask questions about these teretil and terenim that my grandmother made me sing while we baked like gak and petit four for hours. But I learned so much from her because she was telling me about this place I had never really visited or engaged with very closely. And so in a way, our conversation here, Mariam and I, to sort of bring you into some of the things that we've often talked about between us, but to start to expand the circle, is a way to think about public scholarship. How do we publish and talk about and think about our research and knowledge mobilization, basically? Like, how do we create our knowledge in partnership with the people that we're a part of, that we work with? And in a way, how do we bring that scholarship back? So in a way, you know, I know that I want to really pass the mic to Mariam, because the solidarity that we've both gleaned from one another is in this space to say all of the things that we've often been like, I've never said that out loud before. And then when we've had our chats, to say them together. And then when we started working on our projects, to start to sort of open up these spaces to talk about them more openly. So I want to pass the mic on to Mariam to talk about this idea of solidarity, and particularly in this spaces of silence that we've often navigated that are explicitly gendered. So take it, Mariam.
Sure, thanks. So yes, I would agree that like the time that, I mean, half of this is just going to be like Carolyn and I like sending love letters back and forth to each other. So sorry, but this is what feminism is. So part of what's been really interesting about being a SWANA person in an academic space, right, is that you're never really doing work for yourself, right? So we've talked a lot about, you know, this sort of like decolonization of the methodologies and also of the communities in which we participate and who this work is made for, right? So like I can write a book about my community and use my skills that I've learned from my community to, you know, do a deeper dive into some of these gendered and sexual dynamics. And then my publisher will sell it for $90, right? For like the 4 other white academics who want to read that work, right? So there's something about just like the work that we do that's also been shifted for me in having a partnership with another SWANA person to be able to sort of like deal with that, especially because I think a lot of our communities I would describe as like very strongly pro-education and also very strongly anti-intellectualism. So really want you to have a degree and really want that degree to be for being a doctor. So like if you're using it for just thinking, like that whole sort of like questioning comes into play. The other thing that's been really crucial in our solidarity is that a lot of times our communities rely on silence to perpetuate patriarchal violence. So I want to clear right off the bat, because I think this is a thing that often comes up. SWANA communities are not more patriarchal than white Western communities, right? Patriarchy, as it turns out, is everywhere. There is more patriarchy than plants in my home, but the mechanisms that SWANA communities use to reinforce patriarchal violence are different than the ones that Western communities use, right? So largely what we see is like in our communities, community is really important. A sense of like bonding and being part of the group is really, really important to who we are. If you break off from the group, a lot of us that have broken off from church communities, from family space, from cultural space have really struggled to like figure out who we are. Like it's really hard to be SWANA on your own, I think, for a lot of folks. And because of that, if you are going against the grain, if you're questioning patriarchal norms, if you're questioning heteronormative norms, heteronormativity, then you're just gonna kind of feel alone. And so this, yeah, exactly, this politics of silence, this conspiracy of silence is largely what my work has been about, because it's this way of saying like, we have to stay together to survive. And the way that we stay together to survive is to ask women and gender expansive folks to just move into the background and put their needs on the back burner. So part of what's really crucial is spaces like these, where people can be in solidarity with one another, where people can break through that silence and have solidarity with one another. I can say personally, like it's been a game changer to just have a buddy who's like, no, you know, you're not the mayor of crazy town. This stuff makes sense. Other people see it. And largely what you see is if you start talking about it, other people will agree with you, right? You'll find people come out of the shadows, but someone has to be that person to kind of like reach out and extend in solidarity to someone else. So I know one thing that Carolyn's called it too is like radical friendshipping, where you're like creating these bonds, allowing there to be space for solidarity, but then also using that, like you're actively chipping away at patriarchy when you do that too. So yeah, it's really important. Like we value community. We are a communal society, and there is a lot of strength to that, but also to recognize the ways that patriarchy leverages the best of who we are as well, right? That's how a lot of systems of oppression work, is they say like, what's best about this culture? What's best about this community? And then use that to kind of like bury some of that more insidious oppression into the ground and make it seem like that's part of the culture. So it's not part of the culture, right? It's a mechanism of the culture, and we can deal with it if we're willing to be in solidarity with one another. This is not actually who we are. Alongside that, right, like there is a lot of ambivalence that women and others experience if you're going to raise those hard questions and critiques. So I've really been inspired by the work of Trinity Minha. I'll put her name in the book in the chat. She wrote a book called Woman, Native, Other, talking about her experience as an Asian American immigrant woman who was also trying to do like feminist solidarity work. And she has this really great sort of framework where she says that women of color who do feminist work or espouse feminist ideals are considered triple traitors, because they're traitors to their race, right? By prioritizing the needs of their gender identities. They're traitors to women because they also prioritize the needs of their racial identity. And then they're traitors to the culture because they're actively pointing out places where the culture needs to shift to accommodate equity for women and gender expansive folks. So, you know, it's really, really hard to do this work on your own. We are deeply programmed and conditioned to do this in community, and having spaces like this, again, are kind of the first step to that. Reaching out in friendship to others, it really is a matter of like finding one other person who can be in solidarity with you. So this whole framework, not just our journey together and our solidarity with one another, but also the project that we were able to, well, really Carolyn and I was kind of just tagging along on this project together. We want to present that as a case study for a way that we as Coptic women have stepped in to that kind of solidarity and trying to break through some of those conspiracies of silence. So I'll turn it over to Carolyn to talk a little bit about, you know, how we are using gendered Coptic music culture as a case study for these larger patriarchal issues. And of course, as a caveat, we know not everyone here is Coptic and that these issues are broader than Coptic issues, right? But a lot of this can be extended out to larger SWANA communities, but we're Coptic, this is what we did. We're going to present it as a case study and see how we can expand that out. So I'll turn it over to Carolyn.
Thank you, Mariam. One thing I realized now as I was moving the slide, I didn't get the chance to chat about this, but in the kind of spirit, both of like bravery, camaraderie, partnership, often I have been trained, at least as an ethnographer, to do these private interviews where then I have sort of the last word, and I sit down and I write my own analysis as the expert, and then I sort of produce it for other audiences that are typically a part of the academic community and are typically racialized white. And so one of the kind of angles that we've taken is to sort of make these conversations that were typically sort of held behind closed doors public. So you'll notice that, you know, in the kind of conversation Mariam and I are having here, there's another one actually on the Instagram that again highlights at the very beginning of our collaboration on this work, you know, our first sort of nervous foray into like starting to ask these questions out loud. And one of the things that really I learned so much in thinking about silence and reading Mariam's work and reading Mariam's book was, you know, how is silence engendered through sound? So how is it that our Coptic music culture teaches us what we can talk about, what we can't talk about, how to carry ourselves in public spaces, how we imagine the afterlife, how we imagine ourselves, our relationship to God, and what happens, and among many other things, but what happens is people then perhaps start to ask questions, move away, decenter some of these narratives. What happens to their relationship with the music? What happens as people are unlearning so much of what they've learned about themselves through the music itself? So one of the kind of conversations that we had early on, and I hope you don't mind, I will jump around a little bit on the slides, is thinking about how Coptic music, Coptic liturgical music, for example, going to a liturgy every Sunday, teaches us about our world. And I even add ... our worlds. So in this idea that even you know, an eschatological worldview. So what happens to us after we die? What is the perspective? How did we arrive to the world? What is our purpose in the world? What will we do after we die? And one of the richest, you know, and of course my case study is with the Coptic community, but this narrative is actually pulled from many communities. Even the SWANA community has deeply shared parallels with what I'm about to describe. But it's this idea that, you know, one sort of arrives into the world deeply connected to the divine, and that music becomes one of the mediums in which one can access the sort of afterlife. And for Copts, imagine that the afterlife, after death, Copts deeply believe that it is a space of eternal tesbih, or praise, that heaven is sounded. And I remember standing on the right side of the pew next to my mom, watching all of the dudes up front and being like, I wonder, like, is it going to be the same format? Like, is it going to be also segregated up there? Like, because one of the things I learned was maybe don't sing too loud. You know, you don't want to stick out too much. And these were some of the lessons I really began to learn about the ways in which we learn about our gender and our comportment through the music. So one of the kind of bigger key, I don't know how many of you, you know, maybe have heard this sort of being thrown around at you, but this idea of, you know, if one sings too loud, or if one sort of gets behind a mic, that the term aib pops up, not haram, aib. And aib, you know, I sort of pulled it out just from Wikipedia. You can see the definition here is something, you know, sort of like a little bit shameful, or a little bit, you know, sort of a sign of disgrace or weakness. But as I started to sort of dig more and more within the Coptic community, I learned that this was a phrase that was often used to describe women's voices if they stick out. So women's voices were like so I'll show you, I'll hop onto this project that Mariam and I worked together on called Coptic Women Sing Too. And I'll pop here and I'll walk you through the website for 1 second, but I wanted to show you just the kind of spaces in which Aib was being used. And one of them is the Pope distinctly talking about how if a woman's voice sticks out, it's almost as if she's naked. I won't play the video, but I will read to you what he says. And he says here, somebody asks the Pope, what's your holiness's opinion about a woman who wants to stand in front of the church and actually sing the Vespers alongside deacons? And he said, well, wait, a woman and a man standing together? This is aib, the hagaib. The church needs a tough priest, asis hemish. So this is again gendering men, about how they need to be sort of comported around women, who brings this girl down and tells her to go sit there directly. This is not good. And the idea that if men and women sing together, it, number one, sonically doesn't match, but also that it exposes a woman. It exposes her voice, but only because this is directly connected to the idea broadly shared in the Middle East that a woman's voice in religious settings is known as a aura. Literally, the etymological definition of that word is that it's a sexual organ. The same kind of levying doesn't happen to men's voices. And so as an extension of a woman's sexuality or genitals, it is something that needs to be covered. So in the same way that Mariam was talking about this idea of what do we learn from our soundscapes about how we see the world, you can see that in this context, tuning into the ways in which Coptic music is gendered teaches us about the relationship that the church structures around gender, around intergendered relationships, so how men and women, or people who identify as strictly men and women identify, and anything that falls outside of that starts to kind of decenter and trouble some of that narrative. So in a way, tuning into Coptic music is actually kind of a proxy as to how the rest of life should be lived and how relationships should be crafted. And there are often many clues. So if it's not just about a woman's voice, one gentle space to start is baptism. So, you know, I learned this when I produced two boys, but boys sort of come up and are ready to be baptized at the 40-day mark, but a girl has to be baptized at the 80-day mark. And I remember asking, like, can someone tell me why? And the question was, well, you know, a woman's body is not clean after she produces a baby, but for a boy, it's about 40 days. And for a girl, it's 80 days. And, you know, scientifically, a woman does bleed for about a month after a baby is born. But to see the ways in which value and meaning is mapped onto that gives us a clue as to the ways in which women are valued or and men are valued in that space. So even after the baptism, how these young babies are dressed also gives us an idea of the expected roles that they're supposed to fill. So for young boys, they're dressed typically as young priests or little patriarchs, like little popes. And the young women are often dressed as young baby girls are often dressed as brides. So in our songs, we often sing about the church as a beautiful bride. And we often sing about gendering the church as female, but something that is to be sort of consumed and entered. And so it's this idea of what meanings are we mapping with the kind of musical spaces that we enter. So gender isn't operating by itself, it's deeply intersectional. And this is often a conversation Mariam and I have about what other proxies are being set through sound itself. So I want to pass you the mic, Mariam, to kind of walk us through, like, what are the kind of intersectional values that we're sort of taking in, even as the music sort of passes through our bodies, in our ears, and even as it's produced outside through our voices that are producing it too. So I'll pass you the mic.
Yeah, I think the main question that we've been asking through this project is, what is music a proxy for, right? Like, what does music stand in here for? So, you know, one of the conversations we had really early on when we started this conversation is, look, not to toot my own horn, but beep, beep. I have a PhD in gender and religion, okay? I would say that of people, I have my finger on the pulse of like gender issues and women's issues in religion. It's kind of like my whole personality, right? It's my whole job. It's like who I am, right? And when you tell people in our field that one of the major points of struggle for women in the Coptic church is singing, they're like, what? That's a thing, right? Because like all these other spaces are, right, thinking about, you know, leadership, about, you know, sacred text. And the reality is like, we're thinking about that too, but music and singing and voices being heard is like a stand-in for all those other things, right? It's a proxy. It's one issue that then has like all of these pieces radiating out that speak to all of this other stuff. So one quick example I can give you is that here in Southern California, I was part of a group that started a women's ecclesiastical choir in Los Angeles. And, you know, it was a big deal when it started because people were like, women are going to stand in a row and sing. And I participated in that choir for 15 years and was a leader in that choir. And at some point during my time in that choir, I got engaged. And after I got engaged, one day after the liturgy, all of the other girls came up to me and they were like, are you still going to participate in the choir now that you're getting married? And I was like, what? Yeah, like, why would that change? But there was this expectation that getting married, right, being a wife, possibly like, which also in our community means being a mother, right, means the potentiality of motherhood, would be incompatible with having my voice heard, right? So there's this place where it's like, well, now you're kind of going down this other route. You're like continuing down the route of respectable womanhood in our community. So you can no longer participate in this thing where you have your voice heard, right? Having your voice heard, participating in that way is incompatible with the views that we have of respectable womanhood. Largely, our choir started off as adults, but became younger women because adult women found that it was hard to kind of like be in the dating scene when you were doing stuff like that, or would leave when they got engaged or got married or had kids. And not because of the extra labor that goes into motherhood, but because of the respectability piece, right? So there's this thing that's like on its face, it's like, it's just singing, but it's actually not just singing, right? It's a stand-in for all of this other stuff, right? And alongside that, I want to just say, anytime we're talking about gendered experiences, we should also be aware of the other identities that intersect with gender and the politics of that, right? So we can talk about how diaspora impacts that experience, how classism impacts that experience, how respectability politics impacts that experience. As you know, in my own life, when I was in the choir, a big part of how I and other women moved through that space was like, are you from a good family, right? If you're from a good family, then we can make an exception and let you be in the front, right? And let you participate in that. And a lot of what a good family is one of your parents a servant? Are they wealthy, right? So because I came from wealth and because my dad was a well-known servant in the church, it was like, oh, you know, she's bint Moheb, like, let her do what she wants, right? As opposed to if I wasn't somebody like that, it would have been a lot harder to kind of move through that space. But even things like, you know, I think it's easy for us to forget sometimes that the voice is about the body too, right? So it's about, you know, our bodies as sites of violence and sites of oppression as well. So I know because we do everything remotely now, it's easy when we're all just sort of like disembodied squares on Zoom, talking to each other and sharing ideas, to forget that those things are connected to bodies. So Carolyn's point about women's voices being aura, right? Connecting what a woman says back to her genitalia, right? That's like literally what's happening. So I also saw that in that space where we were fighting for women's voices to be heard, that our bodies were being policed, right? That what we wore was being policed, that the choir began to be used as a way to police modesty, that I started getting pushback from folks because I wore my hair curly all the time, and that was not considered a respectable way to present yourself before God, in the way that God made your hair, I guess. Questions about language and what languages we speak when some of us don't have access to mother tongues in diaspora. And having all of those identities come together affects the ways that we can or cannot access sonic modesty. So this is about more than just can women sing, right? We know that women can sing, but it's more about all of these different pieces, the body representation, the class representation, the diasporic and language representations that all kind of come to a head in whether or not we're saying a woman's voice can be heard in this space. So yeah, just another thing to think about is what other pieces of our identities are coming into play as we interact with that kind of patriarchal violence, right? It's never really just about gender. There's a lot more going on. Carolyn, I want to bring it back to you to talk a little bit about how that extends into digital space.
So I mean, I'm as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking like how often and how many conversations around a kitchen table are often happening about like, why can't I take communion if I have my period? And I often think about, you know, some of my conversations with like my mother-in-law, and then like my own mom and a lot of the women in my circles. And often even just sort of growing up, sort of consistently, I remember our early conversation about the ecclesiastical choir was about how, you know, the young boys at church are like automatically ushered into line. It's so that they can become deacons when a bishop arrives. But I remember one of the earliest stories about the ecclesiastical choir was how anybody who wanted to be these, at the time, adult women who had been in the church their whole lives had to train for an additional year before they could become a part of the ecclesiastical choir. So this kind of double standarding sometimes, like these questions, these conversations that we're having, I recognize is actually rumbling everywhere. Mariam, it's not just you and I that are talking about this. There are all of these other spaces in which this is happening. And I began to tune into that, you know, about a couple of years ago when I bumped into your work online. But then I noticed spaces like on YouTube, Coptic women sing. And so it was one of the first spaces I noticed where it was a YouTube channel where I bumped into your video. I bumped into the video of other folks singing Coptic Alhan. And I thought, well, why is that happening? And I remember, you know, I've worked often on Coptic music. And when I Googled Coptic music, this was not the first thing that came up, but rather other largely community-made archives, typically by deacons, typically by priests, all recording priest and deacon activity in voices and faces doing Coptic Alhan. And so I began to recognize that there is a rumbling online in which I wanted to mirror what was happening within the Coptic community. And it's this idea that increasingly, and especially during the pandemic, more and more folks have started to turn to virtual spaces to be able to have these chats and to kind of create this idea of digital diasporas. A scholar named Jennifer Brinkerhoff called them digital diasporas, where people would sort of hop online and have these shared conversations about what it meant to be, what it meant to navigate their spaces, or sometimes have to kind of walk or embody their politics. And so in partnership with Mariam, in learning about some of the number of other Instagram accounts, including Al Mahabba, that taught me a lot, was this kind of rise of a number of Instagram accounts that were starting to challenge, to speak out loud, to have these debates openly about what it means to be a part of the Coptic community, what it means to participate, to sing as a Copt, and to kind of reckon with some of these questions. And so thanks to the grant from Michigan State University and Ohio State University, I was able to bump into Mariam and to start this project called Coptic Women Sing Too, a public exhibit. I'll take you back to the front page and encourage you to check it out. It's a public exhibit that you'll see focuses and really starts to put the lens on women's participation as a part of their liturgical labor in the Orthodox community, that often women are singing too, but just deeply underrepresented or excluded from the kind of conversations around transmission So that is teaching Coptic Alhan, but also being able to labor during the liturgy and to be a part of the congregation. And so what I wanted to do was to take this saying from the Coptic liturgy to heart. One of the passages, one of my favorite passages in the Orthodox liturgy is when it says, as it was from generation to generation and unto all of the ages of ages, amen. Thinking about the transmission of our Coptic faith, liturgy, identity, and it's where the congregation affirms it. It says, we've been doing this for a long time. We've been doing it so well. That's why we're here. And then I recognized in my mind that was gendered as male without understanding that like Coptic women sing too. As a matter of fact, I learned many of my teretin and terenim from my grandmother. It was my mother that consistently had a lot of the alhan on. And so Coptic women sing too builds on the labors of Coptic singing women that already started a digital diaspora, like Coptic Women Sing. And it's in this public exhibit where we think out loud about and have conversations that are mirroring what's already happening on Instagram. So how is Coptic music gendered? How does it fit into a larger perspective about a Coptic Orthodox place in the world and how sound shapes that experience and that encounter, and then how life is lived sonically and in the body and all of the stuff that's connected to that. And so I turned to the courage. Lydia, I often sort of evoke you, and El Mahabba, Progressive Copts is another one, Coptic Survivor. It took a lot of bravery. I think Mariam witnessed me at the beginning when I was still, a bit nervous and scared, but about being able to say out loud what we've often had to think and process. And so what does it mean to sing as a Coptic woman? And I remember writing this line, like singing in the Coptic Orthodox Church as a woman is complicated. And I thought that kind of ambivalence needs to be sounded out loud. And so in a partnership almost, or in camaraderie with other Instagram accounts that I've noticed online, it's this idea of creating Coptic Women Sing Too as a kind of public exhibit in which anyone can engage with how sound is such a powerful way in which we don't just learn about our world, but about how we relate to each other, how we relate to our bodies, and how we relate to the afterlife. I wanted to showcase that in this public exhibit, but we also ran, Mariam helped me to run a parallel Instagram account here that's directly levied for insider Coptic singing women. So that means that anybody can use the hashtag and actually start to showcase and illustrate and really represent what it looks like for Coptic women to sing too. And it's in this space that Mariam has been running Ma'alima Mondays and teaching expertly many of the Coptic hymns and going through a lot of the kind of more intricate canonical hymns to showcase that and to challenge the interpolation of women's voices just as an extension of their sexual organs, but rather that women can be experts, can be a part of the process of teslim without consistently only being identified within this kind of, within a very kind of closed binary that is often sort of mapped onto women's voices and bodies. So it's in these spaces, it's in a space that we're creating right now. We are doing digital diasporing right now and having these chats, even our kind of pivot into a breakout room and having the next chat sort of continues this practice that isn't new. We've been doing it all along. We're sort of mirroring what our Coptic community has already done. On a final note, just as a kind of to bring it full circle, my dissertation about Teretil and Terenim back in 2014 was called The Politics of Disengagement. How the Coptic community navigated structural discrimination and bias in Egypt by withdrawing from public spaces into itself. And one of my first conversations with Mariam was, how do we navigate this new space where Copts don't have that kind of pressure here in the diaspora, but are dealing with other pressures? And we were thinking about this kind of triple and double bind that Coptic women were experiencing in the church. And Mariam, do you remember when you were like, well, at the end of the day, we will vote with our feet? And it's this idea of withdrawing from that space to create something new. So this isn't a moment of levying a kind of very sharp critique at the community, but illustrating not just its resilience, but the ways in which it navigates structural bias. And in this case, we're specifically talking about gender and the kind of double standard that women are experiencing. And that's why they're withdrawing outside and sort of creating these digital spaces online. I hope I didn't tawihna, as they say. I hope I didn't get us lost, but it's something I get excited to talk about. And I know now I want us to create a space to maybe, perhaps rather than breakout rooms, to sort of move into some of the questions that we've set up to start.
I had a couple of things before we do that.
Jump in, sorry.
I was like,
Okay, so jump in.
Yeah, I know. I think this question of divestment, right, that you're bringing up, this voting with our feet, I mean, I think it's the only way to do anything, you know, like, and I say that as someone that spent 15 years being like, I will just continue appealing to power and seeing what happens, right? So I'm not telling everyone that they have to leave the church or like leave whatever patriarchal spaces they're in. Obviously, like, I think that the church is a problematic patriarchal institution and I still love it very deeply and miss it every day of my life. And I continue to mess with other problematic institutions. My money is in a bank. It's not under my mattress. So like, I get it. We all do what we have to do to live our lives, but I encourage you to think of ways to, even if you continue to involve yourself in a problematic institution, to think of ways that you can also create these diasporic spaces as a form of divestment, right? So you can still, you know, have spaces like these, spaces where you're, you know, interacting with other people and creating other community outside of that institution that gives you sort of the freedom, right? Because that's really the only thing that part of the power that our patriarchal institutions have is that we have largely believed the narrative that they are the only option, right? And so most of us feel trapped in these kinds of spaces because we're like, well, what will happen if we leave? That's why solidarity friendships, radical friendshipping is really important. That's why creating these alternative spaces for people to continue to feel secure in their identities and communities is crucial if we're going to actually like push those patriarchal institutions to change. So divestment, I think, is the key. And by divestment, I don't mean like leave everything that's important to you. I just mean create alternative spaces. Maybe you do leave, maybe you don't, like that's you, like we'll talk about it later. But like, you know, I think just creating those alternative spaces to break down that false narrative that the patriarchal norms and institutions are the only options available to us, right? Because I'm sure all of us have heard someone say, I hear this every other day from like family members who will be like, what can we do, right? It's just the way it is, right? But it's not actually just the way it is if we create another way of being. And that also gives us space to think about other ways of being for ourselves. So one thing that I think I experienced during my 15 years in the choir is that it had a really masculinizing effect on me. Because singing was seen as a masculine thing, having your voice heard was seen as a really masculine thing. I was treated in our space as a masculine person, and I began to see myself as a masculine person. And it wasn't until I started like even before I left the church, it was like interacting with other spaces who were like, no, you're like really feminine. And I was like, oh yeah, oh, that's like a thing, right? But if you're only in that space, then you only get contextualized in that space, right? So broadening up our spaces, giving ourselves those alternatives gives us opportunities to be more broadly contextualized and to open up our worlds a little bit more and to decide who we want to be while still being in community, right? Because none of us want to just do this whole like live, laugh, love thing where we like shoot off to another country and like try to figure ourselves out. That's not like who we are. That's not the community that we're a part of. So staying in that community while broadening your world, I think really becomes the thing that allows you to contextualize yourself a little bit broader as well. That's all I wanted to add to what you were saying.
Thank you for that. I mean, this is a perfect way then to segue, I think, to open up the floor and to consider, we brought some of these questions here, thinking that maybe we can start the conversation. I'd love to maybe, what I'll do is maybe cut and paste them and put them into the chat so I can stop running the presentation so I can see everybody's faces and put them here. And then maybe we can open up the floor. Mariam and I did a lot of the talking and sort of brought you into the conversations that we often have together. But I want to expand the village. I want to expand this idea of the radical friendshipping where we practice together what it's like to sort of chat through this out loud. So the questions that Mariam and I brought, but welcome you to bring your own, put them into the chat, is, thinking, to take a moment to reflect and ask, what are other proxies for gender in our community that you've noticed or you've encountered or you've had to reckon with? And to invite you to think and to sound it out loud here with the kind of camaraderie that this space offers. And then the second one, to start to kind of pivot into now sort of activizing, embodying what it is the worlds that we want to see and to hear. And here it's, how do we build meaningful solidarity that erodes patriarchal violence in our communities and in our soundscapes? So sort of strategizing, you can hear Mariam and I sort of strategizing our camaraderie, like gleaning, building these villages, building intellectual villages, building villages of camaraderie around our shared experience of Copticity and our own reckoning with Copticity, and having a space to learn how to ask tough questions. It took us a while to it took me a while. I won't speak for Mariam. Mariam, you arrived.
Me too.
But it took me a while to learn how to ask hard questions because I was afraid. And I began to ask myself, like, what am I afraid of? And recognizing that my thinking had been shaped, that there were certain, in Arabic, they say khutut hamra, or red lines, in which we're not, why would I ask that question? And I sort of understand what that means. So this is a space that I hope we can open up, and I'll sort of maybe bat the ball to Irini and let you facilitate this. But this is sort of what we brought to the floor, and I'll pass it to you to take it from there.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you all so much for your presentation. I learned a lot, and I was taking a lot of notes on my computer. So thank you all very much. I especially liked the points about being a triple trader and the triple and double bind that you mentioned. And I think that was very concise and well put. Thank you so much. Yes, so the first question that we see in the chat is, what are other proxies for gender in our communities? And I'll first open it to the floor. I have a few thoughts, but I don't want to jump in and abuse my facilitator position.
Well, maybe jump in.
Okay.
Because I feel like people are still processing the whole conversation. So yeah. Sure.
So I don't know if I'm using the word proxy correctly. I know it means like a stand-in, but the first thought that I had was, and this was touched on in the presentation, but if a woman is menstruating, she cannot receive communion. But from a young age, especially when I started, I thought it was interesting because menstrual blood is life-giving blood because it's a sign that you are able to produce life, right? And in communion, we are consuming what we are considering, life-giving blood. So it's an interesting contradiction that, from the male point of view, a male's blood is life-giving, symbolically, but then the woman's blood, which is literally life-giving, it's not symbolic, it's literal, it's considered, unclean and dirty. So the first thought that I had as a proxy for gender in our community is blood. So a woman's blood is considered unclean, even though it's literally life-giving. Meanwhile, the male's blood is symbolically life-giving. I'll stop there so before I say anything heretical, but yeah, so that was my first thought. And I know that puts a lot of pressure on like very young girls too. So I used to be a servant for middle school girls. Lydia was too. So Lydia, if you want to add anything to this, but it would come up in our lessons because of course we would do lessons with them about menstruation, growing up, puberty and all that. And that was always a question that they had. And I would always want to be honest with them, like, this is church dogma. Like, I would never say it was, a holy practice or something like God had, wanted for all of us. I would just say dogma. So kind of putting the blame on, men and men's rules. But, and it's a very sad thing, because they're 12, 13, and if you've ever worked with 12 or 13-year-old girls, they're very, I don't know how to say it. They're very alert, I think, especially, because they're women of color too, and they're Coptic women. I think they just notice so many things, and like so many things that by the time you're an adult, you sort of just put to the back of your mind, or you're like, that's just how it is. But they'll point it out, so that's how children are. And so they brought all of these questions, about menstruation, puberty, why are we being treated differently? So sorry, I'm jumping to the second question, but building meaningful solidarity within patriarchal spaces, and how can we do that? So sort of how I tried to do it as a servant was not, because of course other servants would shut all of those questions down immediately and would say, it's shameful for these questions to be asked. It's shameful for you all to disobey, right? So you need to be quiet and listen to the lesson to the end. Don't interrupt, do what we say. But, as a servant for these girls, and remembering how it was to be a girl like that too, just dead quiet throughout all lessons, and not, disrupting anything. I would try my best as a servant to get them to ask those questions. And unfortunately, I wasn't brave enough to ever be very direct and say, just flat out like it is sexist, but, I would nonetheless put it on, men and men's rules rather than God and God's rules. But anyway, so those are my thoughts on these two really great questions. But I wanted to open it to the floor now. So talking about other proxies for gender in our community, and also how to build solidarity within our community. What are some thoughts? And also feel free to comment on what's already been said. So in the lesson, we learned music as a proxy for gender. I really love how concise you all were. Like, I feel, attending academic conferences or lectures, it's very rare to find speakers who are concise, right? But I love how to the point everything that you guys said was, it was a very excellent presentation. But nonetheless, if you all want to comment on proxies that have already been mentioned, such as music, please feel free to do so.
I'm sorry, I forgot how to raise your hand on Zoom, but so I wanted to continue what you were saying, Irini. Sorry if I said your name. Did I say your name right, Irini? Right.
It's a long E in every syllable. So Irini.
Irini. Okay. Mm-hmm. So yes, menstruation and taking communion. So I also dealt with that when I was younger. I remember my mom telling me, when she first told me that, oh, you're on your period, you can't take communion. I remember being upset. I also thought that it was like really silly. I was like, well, why not? And I don't know if there's the same justification in the Coptic Church, but I'm Eastern Orthodox, so like similar. But I've been told that like it's because you can't take communion when you have an like open wound, and like if you're like, or like you're sick, or you're like in that way. And so like if you're bleeding, and then when you're menstruating, you're also bleeding. But the thing that makes me angry about that is like, it's when you're menstruating, it's not a wound. It's not like you're injured. It's, a natural, normal thing that women do. So, but I also remember my mom, I also remember my mom like giving me the justification that, oh, don't you want to be like in your best like condition or best self when you're going in front of God, when you're taking the communion. So that's kind of the way she made me feel like kind of better about it, even though I still was like okay. But so I definitely agree that that's definitely like a proxy. So I just wanted to add on to that too.
Yeah, thank you.
I jump
Yeah.
in just to kind of talk about this idea of a wound or sickness, but there is a rite in which in the Orthodox Church, there's the Eucharist is shared with someone who is sick. It's brought to the bedside. So even if they are both wounded, which again sort of assigns a particular value to women's genitalia and the natural processes that happen with our bodies so that they can be life-giving. But even that gentle double standard there is again a broader conversation about the value that's drawn on a woman's body and not on other bodies. So I just wanted to highlight that. So I'm sorry to jump in, but it's just such a great example of where that double standard still lies.
Sorry, I'm trying to stay out of it and let other people talk, but I can't help it. So just a couple things that I was thinking about while y'all were just talking. I mean, obviously, first of all, I think in these spaces, it's worth also providing the caveat that not all women menstruate and not all menstruating people are women. And we are, reducing that because the spaces that we're in reduce it, right? So just being aware of that, right? Like sometimes men menstruate, sometimes women don't menstruate. These conversations about gender and body are complicated, right? Beyond just sort of like binary space. But, to the extent that we're talking about the Coptic Church and other spaces that use menstrual taboos, that's part of it, right? Like it's also a reinforcing of a binary. So